Jaworski with Multiversity Comics, and I'm here with webcomic and New York Times comic artist and writer Tony Wolff. So Tony, tell us first about your webcomic Greenpoint of View. It is an autobiographical comic using the concept of place to tell a certain story of your life.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on, first of all. Are we rocking? Okay, cool. Thanks for having me on. So, a number of years ago, I had always drawn for fun, but I hadn't really made my own comics since I was a teenager. And I had a friend who really urged me to start making my own comics. And I thought, I don't know that I have any ideas for fiction writing that I felt excited about, that I thought were good enough, very perfectionistic and hard on myself. And he was like, well, do something autobio. And I thought, oh, okay, but I've seen a lot of autobio in the world. There's so many years of so many great cartoonists, and Dean Haspiel and Harvey Pekar and so many people. But I was inspired by a number of friends I knew who somehow found a way to create new autobio that felt fresh. So I was toying with the idea of doing something about my neighborhood, because I lived in Greenpoint for 23 years in the same apartment. And I had just read Harvey Pekar's Cleveland, which is one of his last works published after he passed away. Alan Moore wrote the introduction for this Harvey Pekar book. And in Harvey Pekar's Cleveland, which is drawn by Joseph Remnant, who's an amazing indie comic illustrator, he managed to do, Harvey sort of did his life story, but interwove it with the story and history of the city of Cleveland, which is much beloved by Harvey. He grew up in Cleveland. It's his city. They have a statue of him now, Harvey Pekar, in a park in Cleveland. And so I put the book down and I thought, that was fascinating how it was about both. It was about Harvey, but it was also about the city and the history of the city. But he just weaved it in such a subtle way. So then a month later I thought, that's it. That's what I'll do with a comic, autobio comics from my life, but all focused around and taking place in, and sometimes dealing with the history of Greenpoint. And my friend said, well, you know what you have to call it. This is my friend Mike Turney. And he said, I said, what? I don't know what to call it yet. And he said, you have to call it Greenpoint of View. And I thought, it's a little cheesy, it's a cutesy pun, but you know what? It's cutesy in the way that I'm totally okay with. I said, that's a great name, Greenpoint of View. People will remember it at the very least, whether they think it's cheesy or not. And that started off the comic. I did 4 short stories of this comic. Then I did some other short stories, and then that led to me writing and drawing comics for the New York Times, which I've been thrilled to do. That's a very long answer, I apologize, but...
No, that's okay. We're going to touch on a couple of those other things in a bit, but when people hear Greenpoint these days, unless you're from the New York City area, you hear Greenpoint, you think HBO's Girls. Now, you lived in this neighborhood for 2 decades. We're not going to say what years.
We can say it, I don't care.
You've seen a lot of changes. So what are some of the biggest changes you saw in those 22 years in a neighborhood that was practically not known outside of the 5 boroughs to something that came to national presence because of HBO's Girls?
Definitely. So I moved to Greenpoint in 1996 in the fall. And I only moved out about 2 years ago to live with my girlfriend in New Jersey, in Hoboken. So Greenpoint really was a beneficiary of the spillover from what we now know as hipster Williamsburg. Williamsburg blew up first. Williamsburg underwent the whole process of the good and the perhaps not as good of gentrification, the pros and cons of that. Williamsburg in the 80s was a very dangerous place. I just took a cab yesterday, and the guy said I would never walk in Williamsburg during the daytime, during a weekday in the 80s and early 90s. Williamsburg was, I believe it was called Vietnam by police in the early 90s. It was a very drug-ridden, very challenging area. So Williamsburg began becoming gentrified. The life cycle that happened in the East Village in the 60s that made the East Village the center of hippiedom in the 60s. Essentially, a neighborhood is cheap. The artists and bohemian people move there when they graduate college because it is cheap and it had proximity to the city. Very, very close, obviously Williamsburg right next door. once the artsy types and the college, the college kids who sort of don't know what they're going to do, they're English majors, who knows what they are. Some of them might be scientists, they don't all have to be artsy. They're bartenders, whatever they're doing, they began sort of taking over Williamsburg. And then the art galleries start coming, and then the new restaurants start coming, and then the bars that are the bohemian young people's bars start coming. And I moved into Greenpoint right several years after that had begun in Williamsburg. And I moved into Greenpoint at a time when Williamsburg was now quite safe. I saw grandparents, grandmothers walking down the streets late at night alone, old people walking. All of this tells you when you're scouting out a neighborhood, when you're going to get a new apartment in the Manhattan area or the Brooklyn and Queens area, this is a safe neighborhood. It's become safe now. So once I moved into Greenpoint, I saw that spillover start to happen. I saw the bohemian, the artsy people, the young people, everyone, much like Williamsburg now. Back then, everyone there was about 23, and the generations have turned over, and now many people in Williamsburg are about 23 to 28. In any case, Greenpoint was mostly very quiet, mostly Polish, Russian. Many of the store signs were in Polish, written in Polish or Russian. There's also a Latin American section of Greenpoint down by Greenpoint Avenue. And Greenpoint started to have the trendy new restaurants and the bohemian artsy bars. The word hipster was not in existence in our society the way we know it when I moved in. When I moved in, hipster meant a bohemian beatnik from the 60s or the 1950s, and you'd go to a poetry reading and they wouldn't clap, they would snap their hands. That's what a hipster was in around 1956. So then this term gets resurrected, and hipster becomes, for a social movement of a kind, of basically young artsy people in the late 90s, and the trucker hats, and the plaid shirts, and the PBR, and all of that stuff began. So I thought, all right, that'll be my first comic. I didn't want to only write about gentrification, because really, there have been far greater social thinkers. There were already too many articles about gentrification at that time. Look, it's gentrification. It's good for some people, and it's less good for others. It harms some populations, and it seems to benefit others. It's tough. People get priced out of neighborhoods. It's a very mixed bag.
Yeah, we're starting to see that now, too. I know there's at least 2 bars that I remember going to in my early 20s in Greenpoint, Enid's and our bar, that are no longer there because they've gotten priced out of the neighborhood.
Right. Yeah, so I didn't want the comic series to be about gentrification because, once again, you don't want to tell an audience what to think. I didn't want to preach or proselytize at that time about those topics. And I just wanted to address what I saw, the changes that I saw. And then I wanted all the other Greenpoint stories that I did to be about other topics and to sort of toggle back and forth between personal autobio anecdotes and history of the neighborhood. And so my rule that I gave myself for the series is I'm not allowed to do any stories from my life that didn't occur in Greenpoint while I lived there, or didn't have at least a very significant piece of them that happened in or was about Greenpoint.
So you mentioned 4 stories. I know you probably have a ton of other stories in your head. Are there any that are close to development at this point?
There is one, the 5th Greenpoint of View short story. It'll be a web comic, as they've all been. I have a mini comic on sale too, a printed comic that's on sale at Anyone Comics and online, but mostly they've been web comics. So I have a 5th story that I'm doing now, which is about my favorite old pizza place in the neighborhood, and it was run by this unusually old man who was working like 14-hour days, mostly single-handedly running this pizza place. And he was sort of a beloved figure, sort of one of those figures that's sort of the unofficial mayor of a neighborhood. And I just really liked the guy. And even as early as the 2nd Greenpoint comic that I did, I always thought his name was Carmine. And I always thought, okay, that's a story. I'm going to do a comic about Carmine. And so I am about 60% done with that story now. I'm on page 5. It'll probably be 7 pages. It's languished a little bit. This story has not flowed as smoothly or as rapidly as a lot of the other ones have. But I've also taken on some other commission art. I drew a poster for a friend's feature film. So certain other art projects I took on delayed this story. I'm trying to get this new Greenpoint of View story done by Christmas, by the end of this year. I have about 12 plot lines total, and this will be the 5th. So I've always been slowly working my way through that series of stories. Maybe I'll do more, but 11 or 12 is the magic number as far as what I know I want to do.